When people talk about AI in digital media and ad operations, the conversation can very quickly turn binary. People quickly jump to, is it good or is it bad? Or will I keep my job or will I lose it? But in truth, the impact is far more nuanced. In my session at AdMonsters in Austin, I spoke to a mix of ad operations and sales ops professionals and argued that AI's impact is going to be far more nuanced. There are going to be areas where it's going to be an evolution. There are areas where it's going to be revolutionary impact, and there are some areas where it really is just too early to tell. This talk, in conjunction with AdMonsters, breaks down each category and talks about the future for ad operations. So the first thing I need to do is define what I mean by each of these categories or terms. And let's start with evolution. When I think about evolution, I think about the experience of getting into a car that has the same model that's existed for 20 years. If you get into the 2025 model, it might have sleeker styling, it might have more electronics or digital media on the inside, but the car is really going to drive the same way. You will know how to use the controls. It's very similar experience to that same model of car 20 years ago. And so in the same way, not every AI application is going to be truly transformative. There's going to be a series of incremental improvements in many different areas. And so let's think about what some of those areas might be. I see at least four big buckets of change. The first is around ad serving mechanics. And the reason to believe that this is an area that's going to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary is simply that there's been so much investment in this area in the last 10 years. It wasn't called AI, it was usually called something like machine learning, but all the largest portals and social media companies have been investing in ad serving mechanics using machine learning and have seen significant improvements over that period of time. For that reason, I don't expect that we're going to see a significant change in the near term based simply on AI. In the same category is something like audience segmentation and clustering. This is the idea of how do you create audiences that either look alike or are useful for targeting for an advertiser. Again, this is an area where there's been so much work over a really long period of time by the largest companies. We may see that it's going to be easier to create some of these segments. We may see that you can create more of them in a short period of time. But in terms of the impact on ad operations and advertising performance, I just don't see it being significantly different than what we've seen over the last few years. Another area where it is reasonable to expect that we're going to continue the trajectory that we have been on is around forecasting and inventory management. Again, it's not to say that it's not going to improve, but simply that we're not going to see a significant improvement that is going to change the way we all do our jobs. Maybe with the use of AI, some of the inventory management will be a little bit better, but I'd liken this to the forecast for 2 days out being 77 instead of 75, and maybe you can get your prediction better and it's a degree or two closer, but it's not really going to change your life. And then finally, and I'll put a little bit of an asterisk by this one, reporting and dashboarding. Reporting and dashboarding has obviously already been a huge area of investment. And if we're just simply talking about how an executive team reviews their business performance, I view that to continue on its current trajectory. The asterisk or the slight caveat on this one is that ad hoc querying against some of the data will get significantly easier as we used to move to chat-based prompts, but the dashboards that are set up on a regular basis are going to provide much the same information that has been available for many years. So that's a few areas that may change, but only on an incremental or an evolutionary basis. So what does the impact to that mean? Maybe there's going to be slightly more complexity, slightly more going on in the black box. We're going to see some incremental efficiency, but likely not driven, we won't see job loss that is driven primarily in these four areas. We're going to see that ad operations is going to need to continue to be an interpreter of the AI outputs. So, if we think about the evolutionary category, and again, I'm obviously skipping over this quickly because it's where the least is changing, if you believe my arguments. The takeaways are for an ad ops team or a sales ops team, don't over rotate into the incremental areas. Yes, there's going to be changes, but you're not going to need to change your processes. The second area that follows on from the first is hold your vendors accountable for those small gains, but save your energy for the true disruption that's going to occur in other parts of your business. All right, that out of the way, let's get to some areas where we actually are going to see significant disruption. And staying with the car analogy, if the previous car analogy for evolution was that we're going to move from one version of a 2005 car to 2025, here we see significant changes. And the analogy I use is a self-driving car. So here we're going to see fundamental changes in how the ad operations work gets done. Before I get into the specific areas of impact, I need to talk about how we are going to see a new layer of infrastructure. Now, anyone who's familiar with AI more broadly will be familiar with what's called the Model Context Protocol. And this is essentially a way that AI agents can talk to each other. It's a standard protocol. Now, it's not designed particularly for advertising or digital advertising. And so there has been a push within our industry recently to create what's known as the Advertising Context Protocol, or AdCP, which sits on top of the Model Context Protocol. Think of this like the USB-C for advertising workflows. And it's going to define specific verbs or tasks that get done by either the buying agent or the selling agent so that they can communicate more effectively. And then on top of that, we're going to see individual agents who are doing some of the specific activities. They're going to do the automation of the campaign briefs. They're going to do the role of a media planner. They may look at cross-platform analytics. And so the graphic that I'm showing now shows that in a sense there are different layers of infrastructure that are going to be developed. Now, this particular ad context protocol has been proposed by a number of different companies, including companies like Yahoo and Rubicon, Magnite, and others. But notice I didn't say Google and Meta. And so it is reasonable to expect that this may not get broad adoption. But I think the concept here is even if it doesn't, something will along these lines. There's going to need to be infrastructure that defines how these agents interact with each other. All right, so that said, what are the areas where we should expect to see what I'm going to call significant disruption? The first is in creative generation and testing. Right now, of course, it's relatively easy to create a new creative ad that's going to run on a website. But you're creating one. Or maybe you've got some sort of smart bot running in the background and you can create a handful. We are now starting to see that instead of creating 1, 2, or 3 creatives for a campaign, we are creating hundreds or thousands of potential different creative assets that could be tested and run on a plethora of different websites. This is going to move beyond the level that humans can review all of the different creative assets. And so attention is going to have to move from how do I review every creative asset to how do I review those or spot check or review those that have problems associated with them. Another area where we should expect to see significant disruption is in workflow compression. The tasks that now take 5, 10, 20 different steps for an ad operations team are going to be compressed, where we have a command to start the task. We're going to look at the output to check that it executed correctly, and hopefully everything in between is relatively seamless. Again, we're going to need to think about how to put some controls around that to ensure that the actual desired output was as expected, but that workflow for an ad operations team should be significantly compressed. Along that same lines, we're going to start to see execution agents that actually work independently. Instead of needing to have a human approve or not approve, they're going to take requests and start to execute against the actions that need to be done. Again, another area we're going to need to think about: what are the guardrails that we have on a system like this so that we have some controls in place. And then the other area where we could see core disruption is in client-facing protocols, where we have situations where an advertiser may think that they're dealing with a publisher through a chat interface, and of course they're dealing with a chat bot. When I raised this with the team in Austin, this was one of the areas, of course, that many people had concerns about, that they view their client services team as sort of the front line of defense for their company, or actually in some cases the best representation of why the company is doing great stuff. This is an area where, again, we're going to see changes in terms of the client-facing interactions. It's not clear whether we're going to see some of the advertisers start to get disillusioned, unhappy with interactions, but it's going to be an area where there is going to be significant changes. So what does that mean in terms of the potential impact to the ad operations team? The first is a role definition change for many people in an ad operations team. We're going to move to a world where a lot more prompting and reviewing is going on than actually carrying out the individual steps of entering campaign lines and setting up the campaign goals. We're going to move to a world where there's quality controls that need to be upgraded to put guardrails in place. We are probably going to find that emotional intelligence is still going to count. Back to the client-facing bots that I'm talking about, when those bots fail and a human needs to step in, that human better understand the client's business and they better be able to solve it in a way that AI can't. So, what are the takeaways for areas where we see that it's more revolutionary rather than evolutionary? The key is that AdOps teams need to move from a world of execution to more supervision and implementation. The efficiency gains are going to be real, but so are the risks. And now let's talk about the areas where it really is too early to tell. I showed sort of a car that was evolving over a number of years. I showed a car that is self-driving for revolution. And this graphic on the highway represents the fact that we don't know. There are potholes, there are flying cars, and there are signs that we don't understand. And so let's talk about a few of those areas. One is that there's a potential for an arms race or conflicting interest. And I'll give an example here between traffic protection, which checks that it's valid human traffic that's arriving to your website or your app, versus fraudulent traffic. Now, on both sides, the companies like Double Verify and IAS that both have the duty to check that the traffic that's coming to a website is valid traffic. They're going to be deploying AI agents on their sides. And of course, the fraudsters are going to be developing their own AI agents that are going to try and mimic human behavior and try to get away with it. And so this is very clearly an area where there's going to be an arms race between the two sides. We're going to see that kind of behavior anywhere that there is conflicting incentives or conflicting ways that the different areas and agents are going to interact. I list here on this graphic publishers versus advertiser. There's going to be some conflict there, probably not as much as between traffic protection and fraudulent AI. Another area that I think we're going to have to keep an eye on is what I'm going to call the black box problem. And this is where we see behavior that we just can't understand. And so an example might be your agent says that you have inventory available that is significantly outside of the realms of your expectation. You might expect that you normally have 1 million impressions a day, and you get an inventory forecast back that says that there's going to be 3 million. The question is that an error? Or does the AI agent know something that you don't? That there's going to be some news story that's going to spike your traffic, or that there's seasonality that you haven't accounted for. And so a lot of work is going to be going into trying to understand what's driving some of those outliers. Another interesting case, and I'll give credit here to Jean-Manuel Azare of Boston Consulting Group, who talked about the following when we were in a pricing conference and he was a speaker. It's the idea of possible collusion that you may not even be aware of. He raised the example of where two AI agents talked to each other and invented their own protocol for interaction. And in that case, they could actually start doing things that the humans on both sides aren't aware of. And again, back to Jean-Manuel Azare, he pointed out that traditionally pricing collusion has always been discovered by going back to look for, did the executives at different companies interact in a way that pointed to collusion? If you had your AI agents talking to each other in a way that you weren't aware of, there could be collusion going on that neither of the executive teams were even aware of. Now, again, this actually points to the need for the protocols that I mentioned earlier to be laid down so that, for example, the AdCP, if you had the right protocols in place, you could understand how the agents were communicating with each other and hopefully take some of this behavior off the table. The other idea is that you need to think about whether your underlying data that is being used by the AI captures the scope of all of your concerns, especially in a world where your AI agent doesn't have access to all of the information that either you have access to about the market, about the news, about what's going on in the world, and so the agent could extrapolate without context. And then finally, we're going to see cases that really are in the category of we just don't even know how to think about these yet. And I tell the story a couple of weeks ago here in San Francisco where someone decided to call a Waymo to a cul-de-sac. And they didn't just call one Waymo, they got 50 of their friends together and they called 50 Waymos from 50 different accounts, all of whom showed up and caused a traffic jam. Now that's an interesting test case so that Waymo now knows that they have to be on the lookout for those kinds of use cases in order to prevent that kind of behavior. We don't know what the digital advertising equivalent is of the Waymo traffic jam, but it will happen, and we're going to need to be on the lookout for those kinds of examples so that we can adjust and set up the right guardrails. So, what are the takeaways? The first is that we need to look for new error patterns that we haven't seen in the past. So, we're going to see fewer typos, and we're going to see more confidently wrong outputs. When we see that, we need to think about a way to how are we going to manage the risk transfer? How do we manage the fact that we're going to have moving from a world of execution errors to model logic errors? So what do we do about it? And there's at least 3 different things we can do. The first is to lean into supervision, not into more execution. We need to learn to experiment cautiously and be alert for confidently wrong outputs. The second major category is to be the builder of those guardrails. We need to demand logs, explainability, reversibility. And we need to think about when there is a problem, what do we do about it? We need to have processes in place. We need to think about the escalation within our various organizations. And we need to think about the governance that we want to put around some of these systems. Then the final piece here is double down on the human advantages. Emotional intelligence and client empathy. I already said that in Austin, it was the area when I presented that most people had the concern of things breaking, was the idea that AI would not be able to replace the human interaction of those market-facing individuals that they had in their ad operations and client services teams. So, takeaways. Adopt AI. Do not fear it. Adapt. So think of ways to blend the machine with the human to take advantage of the best of both worlds. And finally, lead. Take ownership in this area before others do, and particularly before your competitors do. I hope you enjoyed this content. I would love feedback. If anybody has it, please put it in the comments. I will respond. I am James Deaker. I am the Yield Doctor. Thanks for joining.